Hello guys, in today's video we will be covering the trials, tribulations and turmoil of the 1994 Formula 1 season. Before we get into the video, I would like to thank everyone for helping me reach 500 subscribers. It means a lot to me and I hope to continue producing content you all love well into the future. Since my previous video on a crazy season review is the most popular video on my channel, I thought I'd remake it with better quality and a different season. With that being said, let's get into the video. The 1994 season was crazy for many of the same reasons that 1982 was. There were driver deaths, several twists in the driver's title race, and several storylines up and down the field all the time. Even before the season started, there were many talking points. Reigning world champion Alain Prost had left Williams and retired from Formula 1. This meant that Ayrton Senna could finally move from McLaren, who were on the downhill in terms of performance, and join the Grove team after years of trying to join, even offering to race without being paid at one point. Damon Hill stayed with the Williams team for his second season after taking his first ever win in Hungary the previous year and winning two more later on in the season. With Senna gone, the McLaren team promoted Mika Hakkinen to the role of team leader and signed the experienced Martin Brundle from Ligier to partner the young Finn. The up-and-coming Benetton team kept their up-and-coming young prospect Michael Schumacher and replaced the retired Riccardo Patrese with Jirki Jarva-Leto, also known as JJ Leto, who had previously scored a podium for Dallara in 1991. There were also two new teams on the grid in the form of very successful Junior Series outfits, Pacific, and the builders of a 1992 Andrea motor chassis, Simtek. There were a few more driver transfers up and down the field, but there was nothing really special. It wasn't just the drivers who had changed though, the cars had too. Driver aids such as traction control and ABS had been banned in order to stop the drivers relying on technology to drive the car, and the FIA also wanted to reduce speeds. Refueling was also reintroduced for the first time since it was banned originally in 1984. The teams rolled into Brazil and the Interlagos circuit for the first race of the season. Home hero Ayrton Senna took pole position in his Williams, followed by Schumacher's Benetton in second. Third was the Ferrari of John Alesi, then Senna's teammate Damon Hill was in fourth. The rest of the top 10 were rounded out by the Saubers of Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Karl Wendlinger in 5th and 7th, sandwiching Gianni Morbidelli's footwork, who was in 6th. Hakkinen's McLaren was 8th, then the Benetton test driver Jos Verstappen was 9th, with the Japanese Ukyo Katayama's Tyrrell Yamaha in 10th. Senna led from pole position early on, with Alesi second and Schumacher third after he overtook him on the first lap. Schumacher re-overtook the Frenchman on lap 2 and closed Senna's early lead of 4 seconds to reduce it to 1 second by the time both Senna and Schumacher came into the pits on lap 21. Benetton's pit crew were faster than the Williams crew, and so Schuey re-emerged in the lead out of the pit lane. Moving away from the lead battle, on lap 35, there was a huge 4-car pile-up down the Retro-Aposta straight between Verstappen, Brundle, the Jordan of Eddie Irvine and the Ligier of Eric Bernard. Brundle had an engine failure just as Bernard was right behind him and lapped. Verstappen and Irvine were both in turn looking to overtake Bernard. Irvine didn't see Verstappen overtaking him on the left, and so as Irvine himself tried to go left to overtake the Ligier, he pushed Jos onto the grass, forcing the Benetton to lose control and swerve back across the track, collecting Bernard, Irvine and Brundle in one fell swoop. As Verstappen went over Brundle's roll hoop, he penetrated the Englishman's helmet, although luckily this caused no injury. Irvine received a one-race ban for his reckless driving, having already been in hot water with the FIA after unlapping himself in a supposedly unsavoury manner at the previous year's Japanese Grand Prix. His Jordan team appealed the ban, only to have it extended to 3 races in order to stop the teams from attempting to undermine the FIA's authority. Allegedly. Returning to the battle for the lead, Schumacher increased the lead he had on Senna to 10 seconds after they both made their second pit stop. However, by lap 55 of 71, Senna had closed the gap to 5 seconds. However, the Brazilian made a rare mistake coming out of Junção and spun out of the race, ending his chase for victory. Schumacher promptly saw out a dominant victory, the third win of his F1 career, and the other Williams of Damon Hill was second, a full lap down on him by the checkered flag. John Alesi stood on the third step of the podium, with Rubens Barrichello in 4th for Jordan. Katayama was 5th, scoring his first ever career points after joining the F1 grid in 1992. Wendlinger was the 6th and final points scorer in his Sauber. Only 6 other cars finished the opening round of the season, those being the 2 Lotuses of Johnny Herbert and Pedro Lamy in 7th and 10th, Minardi legend Pierluigi Martini in 8th, the LaRousse of Eric Comas in 9th, and the only 2 finishers outside the top 10 being Olivier Panis's Ligier and the Simtek of David Brabham, who was 4 laps down. With those results, Schumacher and Benetton led the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship, with Williams in second thanks to Hill's second place. Ferrari was third, along with Alesi in the drivers' standings, followed by Jordan and Tyrrell in 4th and 5th. The next stop on the F1 circus was Japan. Not the world-renowned Suzuka circuit, or even Fuji that hosted F1 races in the 1976 and 1977 seasons. It wasn't even Autopolis, which had been on the provisional 1993 calendar before being replaced by Donington Park. It was instead held in Okayama at the brand new TI Circuit Aida, and to avoid any confusion, as Suzuka was also on the 1994 schedule, instead of being called the Japanese Grand Prix, it was instead labelled the Pacific Grand Prix. The track hadn't hosted any major competitions before, and was particularly short for a Grand Prix venue, only being 2.3 miles long. For reference, Monaco is 2.1 miles long. One driver who wouldn't be enjoying the new track, however, was John Alesi. He crashed at a testing session in Mugello and injured his back. Thus, Nicola Larini replaced him while he recovered, having last raced in F1 in 1992, ironically also driving for Ferrari, replacing a regular driver, although at that time he was replacing an underperforming Ivan Capelli, not someone who had been injured. Nonetheless, he was in the Ferrari car on Friday, but stirred up controversy by telling the Italian media that he had used traction control, despite it being a banned driver aid. He later withdrew the statement. After being given a free race ban for being deemed at fault for the four-car pileup he was involved in at the Brazilian Grand Prix, Eddie Irvine was replaced at Jordan by ex-footwork driver Aguri Suzuki. Senna sat on the pole position for the second time in 2 races after setting the fastest lap time on the Friday qualifying session, with Schumacher again in second. Hill was third, with the McLarens of Hakkinen and Brundle in 4th and 6th sandwiching Gerhard Berger's Ferrari. Larini was 7th from the other Ferrari, then came the Brazilian duo of Rubens Barrichello and the footwork of Christian Fittipaldi in 8th and 9th. Then, Jos Verstappen was 10th in the other Benetton. There was no one really out of position on the grid heading into Sunday's race. Schumacher overtook Senna off the line, then at the first corner of the track the Brazilian was hit off by his ex-teammate Mika Hakkinen's McLaren. Larini, who was still filling in for Alesi, also ambled off, hitting Senna and retiring both cars on the spot. Senna had now retired from both of the opening races of the season in his new Williams team. Mark Blundell also spun his Tyrrell at the first corner, embarrassingly stalling in the middle of the track. After his teammate retired at the start, Damon Hill and the other Williams spun off trying to overtake Hakkinen. However, he recovered from a spin to assume second place before transmission failure scuppered his chances on lap 49 of 83. After his first lap retirement, Senna opted against going back to the pits, instead sitting on the outside of turn 1. He suspected that some drivers, particularly his main rival Schumacher, had been using traction control, which was now banned. He sat there for 10 laps and afterwards confirmed his suspicions that Benetton especially were using the legal driver aids. Another big hitter in the form of Jos Verstappen retired on lap 55 after spinning out, at which point he was 3 laps down on his leading teammate Schumacher. Martin Brundle's McLaren retired from 3rd place after his engine overheated. Another crash happened further back between Michele Alboretto's Minardi and Carl Wendlinger's Sauber, but it was a processional race for Schumacher up front as he beat second place Berger's Ferrari by over a minute. Third went to Barrichello in the Jordan, then the footwork of Christian Fittipaldi was 4th, followed by Frenson's Sauber in 5th. Eric Comas scored the last point in 6th for the Larousse team. The 2 Lotuses of Herbert and Lamy were 7th and 8th, followed by the Ligier pairing of Panis and Bernard in 9th and 10th. The only other finisher was the Simtek of the Austrian rookie Roland Ratzenberger in 11th. After the race, Schumacher led the driver's standings on 20 points after winning both of the opening races of the season. Second was surprisingly Rubens Barrichello on 7 points after his 4th and 3rd places at the previous 2 races. Hill and Berger were tied on 6 points, with the injured Alesi in 5th on 4 points thanks to his opening round podium in Brazil. Benetton obviously led the Constructors' Championship despite their second driver Verstappen failing to score any points, followed by Ferrari and Jordan on 10 points and 7 points respectively. Williams was 4th after Senna's double retirement and Hill's 2nd place in Brazil. Fittipaldi's 4th place in Aida put his footwork team in 5th in the standings. Heading into the San Marino Grand Prix weekend, Ayrton Senna was massively on the back foot, having retired from both of the opening races of the season and having lost 20 World Championship points to his main rival Michael Schumacher. It was a must-win race for the Brazilian if he wanted to mount any sort of title fight against the Benetton driver. Speaking of Benetton, their regular driver JJ Leto had recovered from an injury he got in pre-season testing, so he would replace Jos Verstappen who had subbed in for him in the first 2 races of the season. Furthermore at Jordan, Eddie Irvine was still serving his 3-race ban, and Aguri Suzuki, who had raced in the Pacific Grand Prix, was replaced by Andre de Cesaris for the similar round. Moving into the race weekend itself, Rubens Barrichello in the other Jordan hit a curb in qualifying on Friday and flew into a tyre barrier at 140 miles an hour with an impact measuring 95 G. He suffered a sprained wrist and a broken nose, but more importantly, his tongue was blocking his airway initially. Then Professor Sid Watkins saved his life, and Barrichello woke up in the hospital with Ayrton Senna sat next to his bed. Only once Senna knew Rubens was alive and well, he returned to his car and continued with practice. Barrichello sat out the rest of the weekend, and Senna was fastest in Friday qualifying, half a second clear of the Michael, and 1.6 seconds ahead of teammate Damon Hill. 18 minutes into the Saturday session, Roland Ratzenberger was pushing hard to try and qualify his Simtek car for the second race in a row. He hit the curb at Acqua Minerale, but continued on for another lap. However, as he was navigating the flat-out Villeneuve corner, his front wing went underneath his front wheels, lifting them off the ground at over 200 miles an hour. The car was unable to steer nor brake efficiently, and the Austrian ploughed into the concrete barrier on the outside of a circuit at 195 miles an hour. The car came to a stop in the middle of a track with Ratzenberger's head off to one side. The measured impact of the crash was approximately 500 G, 5 times that of Barrichello's and the most in F1 history. He died on impact as a result of 3 fatal injuries, including a basilar skull fracture, blunt force trauma as a result of the front left wheel entering the cockpit, and a ruptured aorta. The session restarted less than an hour later, but no cars went back out on circuit out of respect to their fallen colleague. This was the first death in a Formula 1 race weekend since Riccardo Piletti at the 1982 Canadian Grand Prix, and the first death in F1 in general since Elio De Angelis when he was testing a Brabham at Paul Ricard in 1986. Senna was on pole position for the race, with Schumacher joining him on the front row. Berger was third, with Senna's teammate Hill fourth. The returning JJ Leto was fifth, with Nicola Larini's Ferrari in sixth. Frenson's Sauber and Häkkinen's McLaren filled the fourth row, and the Tyrrell of Katayama was ninth, with the other Sauber of Wendlinger in 10th. Further down the field, Ratzenberger's fastest time that he set before his fatal accident would have got him the final grid position in 26th and last place. The 27th place driver, the Pacific of Paul Belmondo, was apparently offered Ratzenberger's grid slot, but denied the offer as he believed the Austrian had earned that spot and he hadn't. There was more significant fallout from this death, as Positor Senna had spoken to Sid Watkins about potentially retiring from F1 on the spot before the race. Watkins had told Senna he should quit racing as he'd already won 3 drivers' titles and had nothing more to prove. He was already the best in the world. Despite this, Senna decided to continue racing. Furthermore, in the drivers' briefing before the race, they had all agreed to reform the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, to push for more safety in F1, with Gerhard Berger and Michael Schumacher as directors. Then came the race on Sunday. Michele Alboreto started from the pit lane as his car had developed a problem on the grid. When the lights went green, JJ Leto stalled his Benetton and everyone swerved to avoid him. However, an unsighted Pedro Lamy ran straight into the back of the fin. Debris from the crash flew into the grandstands and injured 8 spectators, including a policeman. The safety car was deployed as a result of the incident, the car itself being an Opel Vectra driven by Max Angelelli. In the drivers' briefings of previous race events, the likes of Senna and Gerhard Berger had raised concerns over the speed that the newly reintroduced safety car travelled, because travelling at safety car speeds reduced tyre and brake temperatures. Under the caution period here in Imola, Senna pulled alongside the pace-setting car and furiously waved at the driver to try and get him to speed up. Unfortunately, the car itself had suffered from brake fading, so it was unable to be pushed to its limits. Then, when the safety car filed the field through the pits, the 2 Erics, Bernard and Comas that is, had a minor collision, causing Comas to experience vibrations and come into the pits on the next lap. The safety car came in at the end of lap 5. On the 7th lap, going through Tamburello, the face of the season, and Formula 1 as a whole, would be changed irrevocably. Senna failed to navigate the flat-out left-hander, going off at a speed in excess of 190 miles an hour. He slammed into the outside barrier, having slowed the car to 130 miles an hour before hitting the concrete wall. Senna died on impact. The 3-time champion, 41-time race winner, and legend of the sport, had come to Plaid's retirement less than 24 hours earlier and was no longer alive. In his cockpit, the track officials found an Austrian flag that he planned to raise in memory of the recently deceased Roland Ratzenberger had he won the race. The red flag was shown following Senna's fatal crash, and Professor Sid Watkins was on scene immediately to administer treatment. However, he said that when he saw the Brazilian's condition, he knew he was dead and that he'd suffered severe brain injuries. An errant piece of suspension entered the cockpit and pierced his helmet, causing deadly head injuries. Ambulances and a helicopter were positioned on the track to provide assistance, but the Larousse team, who had brought Comas into the pits before the red flag, had completed their repairs. Because they were busy fixing the car, the team hadn't realised there was a red flag. Thus, they sent Comas back out onto the track. He approached the crash site at full speed, but marshals gestured at him to slow down. He obliged and slowly came up onto the scene. Coincidentally, it was Senna who had saved Comas' life at the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix weekend, and some fans believe that Comas came back on circuit on purpose, breaking safety protocols to try and repay the favour to Senna. This wasn't true, and commentators were shocked to see the car let out onto the circuit. Comas was so shaken by the scene he saw in front of him approaching the accident that he withdrew from the race and didn't speak about what he saw for 10 years afterwards. The BBC and other networks broadcasting the race chose to change their TV feeds once Senna started receiving treatment, believing the content to be way too upsetting for the audience. Senna was airlifted to the same hospital that Barrichello and Ratzenberger had been in earlier in the weekend. Much controversy had arisen from the helicopter and the Maggiore hospital, as some fans believed that the FIA and F1 were negligent in dealing with the deadly crashes of Senna and Ratzenberger. This is all because, in Italian law, if a racing driver dies in an accident and is pronounced dead at the racetrack itself, then the circuit is treated like a crime scene and is cordoned off with all further events cancelled. Some believe that the FIA and Formula 1 knew that both Ratzenberger and Senna were practically dead on impact, but sent them to the local hospital so that there will be no deaths recorded at the circuit so the race could continue. Nothing ever came of this quirk, but I believe it could definitely be possible. Williams were also tangled up in legal proceedings in Italy for several years after the crash. It was suspected that a part on the car had failed, which caused the fatal accident. They were only fully acquitted of all charges of manslaughter and gross negligence in 2007, a full 13 years later. Back at the racetrack, since Senna had been shipped off to the hospital, merely 37 minutes after a driver had died, the race restarted. Comas had withdrawn from the race, but the other 21 drivers took to the grid for the restart. Frentzen stalled on the second formation lap and started from the pit lane, but everyone else got going and it was Gerhard Berger who took the lead on track as Schumacher got a bad start. However, because the race was being run on aggregate times, Schumacher was still technically leading the race on time difference. Hill in the other Williams clipped the German Benetton driver while overtaking him and dropped to the back of the field because he had to change his nose cone. Michael gave the lead back to Berger on lap 12 as he pitted, but then took it back 4 laps later when the Ferrari retired with handling issues. Following the pit stop shuffling, which saw Mika Hakkinen lead the first laps of his F1 career, Schumacher led from Larini and Hakkinen. Bertrand Gachot's Pacific, David Brabham's Simtek and Gianni Morbidelli's Footwork all retired with mechanical problems. Then on lap 48, Michele Alboreto pitted, but as he left, the right rear wheel came loose from his Minardi as it left the pit lane, hitting 2 Ferrari mechanics and 2 Lotus mechanics, who were left needing hospital treatment. Then, following all of these events, Berger, Bernie Ecclestone and 3-time champion Niki Lauda went to race control to try and get the race stopped on safety grounds, however their request was denied. Christian Fittipaldi retired on lap 55 while battling for 5th place. Schumacher went on to win and took his 3rd win from the first 3 races of the season. This time, he was 54 seconds clear of 2nd place Nicola Larini. Hakkinen resisted a late challenge from Wendlinger's Sauber to retain 3rd, then 5th went to Ukyo Katayama's Tyrrell for his 2nd points finish in 3 races. Hill recovered from his nose change to finish 6th and claim the last point on offer in the race. The podium celebrations were muted, as the drivers wanted to respect Ratzenberger who had died the previous day, and they also must have been aware that Senna was unlikely to survive his accident. Schumacher said he couldn't feel satisfied or happy with his win following the tragic events of the weekend, and Senna was pronounced dead 2 hours after the checkered flag had flew. The FIA immediately announced new safety protocols for the next race in Monaco, with curves in pit lane entries and exits proposed to reduce speeds, and banned people from being in the pit lane if they weren't working on the cars. Senna's state funeral was held on the 5th of May 1994, and 500,000 people lined the streets of Sao Paulo to see his coffin. Ratzenberger's funeral was held 2 days later and was attended by Max Mosley, who felt it was important that no one forgot about Ratzenberger because everyone was talking about Senna. The GPDA was also officially reformed to open talk surrounding driver safety. The deaths at this Grand Prix weekend led to the FIA researching the HANDS device, a neck restraint system that avoided severe neck injuries in racing accidents. Lots of F1 and especially NASCAR drivers had been dying from basilar skull fractures due to excessive G-forces sustained in crashes. Senna was the last driver to die due to a crash in a Formula 1 race until Jules Bianchi died from injuries sustained in the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix 20 years later. After the San Marino race, Schumacher led the Drivers' Championship on 30 points, with Hill joint second with Rubens Barrichello on a mere 7, 23 points behind. Berger and Larini were joint 3rd on 6 points after the Italians made an F1 podium. Benetton led Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship on 30 and 16 points respectively, and Williams and Jordan were joint 3rd on 7 points, and Sauber were next on 6. The F1 paddock headed to Monaco next, having just experienced one of the worst events in sporting history. Before Monaco came around, however, the FIA started formally investigating whether the top teams were using illegal driver aids. They asked Benetton, Ferrari and McLaren to supply copies of their engine management system source code to see if there was any funny business going on. Ferrari immediately obliged, and nothing was found there, but McLaren and Benetton delayed handing theirs in, and still hadn't had it done by the Monaco race weekend, so they were fined $100,000. The Monaco Grand Prix weekend saw Williams and Simtek, the teams of the recently deceased Senna and Ratzenberger, race only one car out of respect. Eddie Irvine was still serving his free race ban, and Andrea De Cesaris filled in for him again. Larousse driver Olivier Beretta became the first monogasque driver to compete in the Monaco Grand Prix since André Testut in 1959. In the first practice session of the weekend on Friday, Carl Wendlinger's Sauber crashed at the seafront chicane with the Austrian hitting the barrier perpendicular to the direction the car was travelling in at a speed of 170 miles an hour. He was taken to a hospital and was in a coma for several weeks following the crash. Sauber thus withdrew completely from this weekend of racing. Qualifying saw Schumacher become the second driver to take pole position that season, with Mika Häkkinen's McLaren joining him on the front row. Berger was third, then came the solitary Williams of Hill in fourth, followed by Alesi and the other Ferrari in fifth. The footwork pair of Fittipaldi and Morbidelli were 6th and 7th, and the second McLaren of Brundle was 8th. Martini's Minardi was 9th, and the top 10 was rounded up by Mark Blundell's Tyrrell. Out of respect for Senna and Ratzenberger, on race day, the first 2 grid slots were left empty and were painted with the Brazilian and Austrian flag. For the first time since 1959, it was the first race where 0 former world champions were racing that day. Häkkinen and Hill made contact just before Saint-Devote and both retired pretty much instantly. Morbidelli and Martini also made contact and retired due to damage before the first corner was even completed. Eric Bernard spun his Ligier out of the race at the Nouvelle Chicane further round lap 1. Nothing much happened in the race until Katayama retired from 6th place on lap 39 due to gearbox failure, then Mark Blundell's engine failed 2 laps later, dropping oil onto the track. Schumacher avoided it, but Berger slipped on it, had to do a 3-point turn at Saint-Devote and then was overtaken by Brundle through Mirabel as his tyres were still dirty. Fittipaldi was running well into the points until his gearbox failed on lap 47. Schumacher led the entire race and took his 4th win from 4 races at the start of the season, along with getting the fastest lap and therefore the first Grand Slam of his career. Brundle was 2nd place, over 37 seconds behind the German, then Berger was 3rd, followed by De Cesaris' Jordan in 4th. John Alesi and Michele Alboreto scored 5th and 6th respectively, collecting the last points, and JJ Leto was just behind in 7th. Homeboy Beretta was 8th, followed by Parnis in 9th, and the other Larousse of Eric Comas in 10th. The only other finisher was the Lotus of Pedro Lamy. Schumacher led the driver's standings on 40 points with a 30-point gap back to 2nd place Berger, then joint 3rd with Damon Hill and Rubens Barrichello. Martin Brundle assumed 4th in the standings after his 2nd place finish. Benetton still led the constructors despite their points all coming from Schumi, then came Ferrari on 22, then McLaren and Jordan on 10. Williams were only 5th on 7 points. Heading into the Spanish Grand Prix weekend, the FIA made some rule changes in the name of safety, restricting the rules surrounding cars' diffusers to reduce cornering speeds. Teams tested their new slower cars before arriving in Catalonia, but reported some problems. Ligier and Williams had suffered from cracked wing mountings thanks to the new parts, but the most severe problems affected the Lotus team. Pedro Lamy was testing at Silverstone and was going 170 miles an hour through Bridge Corner when his rear wing detached, causing him to lose control, fly through the protective fence, and land in a spectator's access tunnel, causing him to be hospitalised. Flavio Briatore criticised the FIA for making a snap decision regarding safety, saying that some parts on his Benetton cars wouldn't pass quality control. I hate to use a cliché quote, but if you've got a problem, change your fucking car. The GPDA took their first executive decision regarding safety at the Spanish Grand Prix. They installed a temporary tyre chicane at Nissan Corner to reduce speeds in one of the faster sections of the circuit. Due to Wendlinger's accident in Monaco, Sauber ran only 1 car throughout the weekend. Schumacher took the 2nd pole position of his career, with Hill lining up 2nd. The Finnish duo of Häkkinen and Leto were 3rd and 4th, with Barrichello's Jordan in 5th. Alesi and Berger were 6th and 7th for Ferrari, and Brundle's McLaren was 8th. David Coulthard, who was making his Grand Prix debut replacing Ayrton Senna, was 9th for Williams, alongside Katayama in 10th. Andrea Montermini, who had come in at Simtek to replace Roland Ratzenberger, crashed heavily in qualifying and broke his ankles, thus failing to qualify. Beretta's engine gave up on the formation lap, but it was Schumacher who led from the off. Barrichello and Berger made contact at the first corner, and the Ferrari skipped across the grass recovering from the incident. Coulthard climbed to 5th place by the time of his first pit stop on lap 16, but stalled in the pits and eventually retired with electrical issues on lap 32. Berger retired on lap 28 with gearbox trouble. Schumacher's gearbox developed problems midway through the race and he was stuck in 5th gear, ceding the lead to Hill. Barrichello spun out on lap 40, then Häkkinen and Leto's engines both failed on lap 49 and 54 respectively. Brundle retired with transmission problems on lap 60 but was classified in the race as he completed 90% race distance. Hill won with 24 seconds back to Schumacher, whose 4-race winning streak was broken. Mark Blundell was 3rd for Tyrrell, then Alesi's Ferrari, Martini's Minardi, and Irvine, on his return, were 4th, 5th and 6th, taking the last points positions. The Ligiers of Parnis and Bernard were 7th and 8th, then Alessandro Zanardi was 9th for Lotus. David Brabham's Simtek was 10th, and the aforementioned Brundle was classified 11th and last after his late retirement. Schumacher's gap at the top of the drivers' standings closed to 29 points as Hill assumed 2nd place in the standings, then the Ferrari duo of Berger and Alesi were 3rd and 4th on 10 and 9 points respectively. Barrichello was still 5th on 7 points. Benetton were clear in the Constructors' Championship, 21 points ahead of Ferrari, then Williams assumed third place ahead of Jordan and McLaren in the top 5. For the Canadian Grand Prix weekend, the FIA brought in another safety measure to reduce speeds in the form of introducing quote-unquote pump fuel, which was closer to commercially available fuel and had lower octane levels, therefore producing less horsepower and engine performance. Similarly to the Spanish Grand Prix, a chicane was installed on the back straight between the hairpins and the old casino corner to reduce cornering speeds. Simtek only entered one car this weekend after Montermini's major accident in Catalunya, while Sauber replaced the recently injured Wendlinger with André de Cesaris, who was making his 200th Grand Prix start this weekend. Schumacher took his third consecutive pole position ahead of a Ferrari duo of Alesi and Berger. Hill was fourth on the grid, followed by his teammate Coulthard, less than a tenth behind. Barrichello was sixth for Jordan, followed by Hakkinen and then McLaren. Irvine was eighth from the other Jordan, then came Katayama's Tyrrell and Frenzen's Sauber rounding out the top 10. Nothing much was reported about the race, other than the results, so it seems that it was actually quite dull. Schumacher won from pole position, surprise surprise, then Hill was second again, followed by the Ferrari pair of Alesi and Berger in third and fourth. Coulthard scored the first points of his F1 career in fifth, then Christian Fittipaldi was initially sixth for footwork but was disqualified for being underweight, thus promoting the second Benetton of JJ Leto to the last points position. Finally, Benetton had both drivers in the points. Also during the race, Eric Comas became the first F1 driver to be penalised for speeding in the pit lane and was given a 10-second stop-go penalty. Schumacher was now on 56 points with Hill on 23 in second. Berger and Alesi were tied on 13 points, then Rubens Barrichello was fifth on 7 points, still. Benetton led the Constructors' Championship on 57 points, with 56 going to Schumi and 1 going to Leto, meaning the German had 98% of the team's points. Heading into the French Grand Prix, there was some more driver swaps. After comments from Schumacher post-race in Canada where he called for Nigel Mansell to return to F1 to increase competition, the championship leader got his wish as a 40-year-old Mansell replaced Coulthard to help Williams win the Constructors' Championship, and also to put a former world champion on the grid because after Senna's death, there were none. Benetton deemed that JJ Leto was unfit following his Imola crash a few races prior and thus brought in Jos Verstappen back to replace him. Simtek found a replacement for Andrea Montermini in the form of French ex-Minardi driver Jean-Marc Gounon. It was Hill who qualified on pole in Magny-Cours, with teammate Mansell alongside on the front row. Schumacher was third, followed by the Ferraris of Alesi and Berger. Then came the Jordans of Irvine and Barrichello in 6th and 7th. Verstappen was 8th from the second Benetton, then Hakkinen was 9th for McLaren and Frentzen was 10th for Sauber. Schumacher shot up into the lead at the start from third place and he stayed there apart from during the pit stop phase. His start reignited allegations that Benetton was using launch control, something that would later be investigated in July. Parnas and Morbidelli crashed into each other on lap 29, but that's all that really got reported on during the race. Schumacher won with Hill in second. Berger was third, more than 50 seconds behind Schumacher, then Frentzen Sauber was fourth and a lap down. Pierluigi Martini was fifth for Minardi, and De Cesaris was sixth for Sauber. Herbert's Lotus was the first driver outside the points in seventh. Fittipaldi was eighth, with Simtek getting their second ever top 10 finish in ninth thanks to Gounon. Mark Blundell's Tyrrell was 10th, and Eric Comas was classified in 11th despite having retired from engine failure on lap 66 of 72. Schumacher still led the Drivers' Championship on 66 points, with Hill second on 29. Berger was third on 17, with Alesi fourth on 13. Barrichello was still chugging along in fifth place for Jordan on 7 points somehow. Benetton led the Constructors' Championship on 67 points, with Ferrari second on 36. Williams were third on 31, with Jordan fourth on 11 and McLaren still fifth on 10 points. Next up was the British Grand Prix in Silverstone. Before that, however, during the month of July, and I can't find a specific date as to when, but the results of the investigation into launch control came back. Before that, however, during the month of July, and I can't find a specific date as to when, but the results of the investigation into launch control and traction control systems in McLaren and Benetton's engine management systems came back. McLaren had options for automatic up and down shifting, but it seems as if they were never used. Meanwhile, Benetton had something deep inside their code. Each setting or control was linked to an option number that was visible and able to be selected. However, there were several options that weren't visible but were able to be selected. One of these options, the infamous number 13, was found, and it acted as a launch control system that had been banned heading into the 1994 season. Benetton claimed the code was redundant and required several complicated steps to activate the code, but in actual fact, it could easily be activated if you plugged a computer into the side of a car. However, since the FIA deemed that the rules mandated that only the use of such system was illegal, not necessarily the existence of these systems, the team was in the clear since the FIA could not prove they were actually used during the race weekend. Heading back to the on-track action, Nigel Mansell had other commitments in the kart series over in the United States, so Coulthard was put back in the car for Silverstone. The margins at the top in qualifying were ultra close as Hill took pole a mere 0.03 of a second faster than Schumacher in second. Berger was third and only 20 thousandths behind Hill. Fourth was the other Ferrari of Alesi, then came Hakkinen, Barrichello and Coulthard in 5th, 6th and 7th. Katayama was 8th for Tyrrell, then the second McLaren at Brundle was 9th, then Verstappen in the second Benetton was 10th. On the formation lap, Schumacher overtook Hill twice, both when leaving the dummy grid and on the formation lap itself. Coulthard stalled on the grid at the start, which forced him to start from the back of the field, and they did a second formation lap to allow for a safe race start. Schumacher overtook Hill twice on his second formation lap. Also, Martin Brundle's engine failed on the second formation lap, so he was unable to take the start. On lap 14, Schumacher was given a 5-second stop-go penalty for his formation lap antics, but he had not served it by lap 21. Thus, he was shown the black flag, which he also ignored, although he said he didn't see the black flag the 3 times he was shown it on the main straight. Benetton told the officials there had been a misunderstanding and brought the German in on lap 27, at which point the black flag was rescinded and he served the original penalty. Hill won the race with Schumacher second and Alesi third. Hakkinen and Barrichello battled for fourth on the final lap, but collided at the final corner, causing both to limp to the checkered flag. However, Barrichello pulled into the pits not realising it was the final tour, and so Hakkinen took fourth with Rubens fifth. Coulthard was 6th, then Katayama's Tyrrell was 7th. Frenzen's Sauber was 8th, then Verstappen was 9th for Benetton. Christian Fittipaldi was 10th for footwork. However, after the race, Benetton was fined $25,000 and Schumacher was given a severe reprimand for both ignoring the stop-go penalty and the black flag. Then, 3 days before the German Grand Prix weekend, the World Motorsports Council, or WMSC, increased the fine for Benetton to $500,000 and handed Schumacher a 2-race ban. They also disqualified him from his second place in the British Grand Prix, moving everyone behind him up a place, so Alesi was 2nd, Hakkinen 3rd, Barrichello 4th, Coulthard 5th and Katayama 6th. With his disqualification, Michael remained on 66 points in the championship, with Hill on 39 closing in. Alesi leapfrogged Berger to take 3rd in the drivers' standings, and Barrichello was still 5th on 10 points now. Benetton was still top in the Constructors' Championship on 67, followed by Williams in 2nd on 43. Ferrari was 3rd on 42, while McLaren led Jordan despite them both having 14 points. Schumacher had a 2-race ban looming over his head, however because Benetton had appealed the WMSC's decision, he would be able to compete until the appeal had been sorted out. The German Grand Prix was held on the forest layout of the circuit, and from the previous year the Senna chicane had been tightened to reduce cornering speeds. The FIA also introduced a new safety measure to stop cars riding too low to the ground and bottom out. They mandated a wooden plank be placed on the underside of every car, and if the plank was worn down too much after the race, the driver would be penalised. It was the Ferraris of Berger and Alesi 1-2 on the grid, with Hill 3rd and Schumacher 4th. Katayama was 5th for Tyrrell, and Coulthard was 6th, followed by the other Tyrrell of Blundell. Hakkinen was 8th, Frentzen was 9th, and Irvine's Jordan rounded out the top 10 on the grid. The 2 Pacific cars of Belmondo and Gasher failed to qualify. The race started, and immediately there were crashes and retirements. Alessandro Zanardi's Lotus and De Cesaris' Sauber made contact in the back of the pack, taking out the Minardis of Alboreto and Martini with them. Then Coulthard and Hakkinen tangled going through the first corner, causing Hakkinen to slide in front of the oncoming pack. Blundell slammed on his brakes to avoid hitting the Finn, but was hit from behind by Irvine's Jordan. Barrichello and Frentzen took to the gravel to avoid the crash, and Barrichello was out on the spot, meanwhile Frentzen retired further around the lap with broken suspension and a puncture. Johnny Herbert and Martin Brundle also made contact, causing Brundle to spin out and Herbert to retire with suspension issues. Hill also made contact with Katayama and was outside the points for the rest of the race, just running around processionally. John Alesi avoided the initial melee, but retired before the first chicane with electrical failure. In total, 11 of the 26 starters retired on the opening lap. To recap, it was both Minardis of Alboreto and Martini, both Lotuses of Herbert and Zanardi, both Saubers of Frentzen and De Cesaris, both Jordans of Irvine and Barrichello, and also Hakkinen, Blundell and Alesi. Katayama retired on lap 6 with throttle issues, then on lap 15 Verstappen came in for a pit stop. We've all seen the iconic images of fuel being sprayed all over his car, then erupt in a ball of flames, leaving him with burns around his eyes. This put him out of the race, obviously. Coulthard was out 2 laps later with electrical problems, and another 2 laps later Brundle was out with engine issues. Schumacher initially challenged Berger for the lead, but fell back and retired on lap 20 with engine failure. Brabham's Simtek contact on lap 37 with clutch issues, then his teammate Gounon retired 2 laps later with engine failure. Only 8 cars finished the race, and Berger won Ferrari's first race since Alain Prost won the 1990 Spanish Grand Prix nearly 4 years earlier. Ligier benefited massively from the attrition, as Panis and Bernard took 2nd and 3rd places on the podium. Then came the footwork duo of Fittipaldi and Morbidelli in 4th and 5th, and the last point went to Eric Comas's Larousse. The other Larousse, Barretto, was 7th, and Hill was 8th as the damage he suffered early on halted his progress. In total, 18 cars didn't finish the race, and there were big championship implications. Hill was unable to use Schumacher's blip in form to close the gap, and both stagnated on their previous points tallies. Berger close to within 12 points of Hill, while Alesi and Barrichello in 4th and 5th stagnated on their tallies but remained in those positions. Benetton still led Ferrari in the constructors, with Williams in 3rd, well clear of McLaren and Jordan, who are both on 14 points. The next race of the season was at the Hungaroring, however there were some off-track talking points going into the weekend. Benetton was in trouble with the FIA because it was found that the fire in Verstappen's pit stop in Hockenheim came as a result of tampering with the fuel filters designed to keep refuelling rigs safe. The governing body scheduled a hearing in September to discuss the incident and potential consequences for the team. Furthermore, Mika Häkkinen had been banned from the Hungarian weekend as a result of his involvement in the crash at the start of the German Grand Prix the race prior. McLaren engine suppliers Peugeot insisted on putting Frenchman Philippe Alliot in the car despite his lack of recent experience. In qualifying, Schumacher took pole position followed by the Williams pair of Hill and Coulthard. Berger was 4th followed by Katayama and Brundle on the 3rd row. Irvine and Frentzen was 7th and 8th, then Parnas and Barrichello completed the top 10. Verstappen and Alliot struggled compared to their teammates in 12th and 14th respectively, and Alesi struggled with handling issues so he languished in 13th. At the start of the race, Hill beat Schumacher off the line but the German beat him onto the brakes going into turn 1. The Jordan pair of Irvine and Barrichello started well but collided with each other at turn 2, retiring them both and Katayama's Tyrrell on the spot. Alesi managed to climb up to 6th on the opening lap, but nothing happened in the race until the pit stops came. Berger stalled at his first stop, dropping in behind Brundle, Alesi and Verstappen. Then the woes continued for the Scarlet team as Alesi's engine failed, causing him to drop oil on the track. David Coulthard crashed out after hitting the oil, and then Berger also had an engine failure on lap 73. Brundle was running 3rd until his electrics died on the final lap, handing his podium position to Verstappen. Schumacher took his 7th win of the season, with Hill in 2nd place, 20 seconds behind. Verstappen was 3rd, as I just mentioned, and Brundle was classified 4th and the last of those on the lead lap. Blundell was 5th and Panis scored 6th from the final point available. Alboreto was 7th, followed by the two Larussas of Comas and Beretta, then the other Ligier, Bernard, was 10th. David Brabham was 11th for Simtek, and Berger was classified 5 laps down with his engine failure. Zanardi was 13th, and Fittipaldi was the last driver classified, having only completed 69 out of the 77 laps. Schumacher thus extended his championship lead on 76 points to Hill's 45, while Berger, Alesi and Barrichello's retirements didn't affect their top 5 championship placings. Benetton's 1-3 put them on 81 points in the constructors, and Ferrari's non-score brought Williams into within 3 points of them. McLaren were 4th on 17, with Jordan still 5th on 14 points. Next up was Spa. Häkkinen was back in the driving seat for McLaren, and Alliot took Beretta's seat at Larousse. Lotus swapped out Zanardi for Belgian pay driver Philippe Adams. As a knee-jerk reaction to the driver deaths early in the season, just like in Catalunya and Hockenheim, changes were made to the circuit layout in Spa. Eau Rouge was transformed into a second-gear chicane to reduce speeds and improve safety. The Friday hour-long qualifying session started wet but dried out late on, prompting the Jordans of Barrichello and Irvine to brave the conditions on slicks. Barrichello took provisional pole, and Irvine was 4th, but when heavy rain fell during Saturday's qualifying session, their positions were confirmed. Barrichello took the record for the youngest pole sitter in F1 history off Andrea De Cesaris after the Italian had held the record for more than 12 years. Barrichello was a mere 22 years and 98 days old when he got his pole position, and he was joined on the front row by Schumacher. Hill was 3rd with the aforementioned Irvine 4th, then Alesi and Verstappen filled the 3rd row. Coulthard and Häkkinen were 7th and 8th, followed by Frentzen and Martini rounding out the top 10. Barrichello led off the line with Schumacher 2nd and Alesi 3rd. The Benetton and Ferrari overtook the Jordan before Alesi's engine gave up on lap 3. The Jordan cars slowly fell back with Schumacher leading the top 4, which consisted of Hill, Coulthard and Häkkinen. Berger's woes from Hungary continued as his engine conked out on lap 12. Homeboy Adams beached his Lotus in the gravel on lap 17, then Coulthard leapfrogged Hill during the first pit stop window, and Barrichello leapfrogged them both before coming in for his first stop. On lap 19, Schumacher made a rare mistake at Fagnes and spun off but recovered still in the lead. Then on the next lap, Barrichello spun out at Pouhon. Brundle repeated the pole sitter's mistake on lap 25 at the same corner, also retiring. During the second pit stop window, Coulthard led the first lap of his F1 career, but it was only a single lap before he came in for his own stop. He was running ahead of Hill until he was called into the pits to check his rear wing. He then developed gearbox problems and fell back down to 6th. When attempting to repass Blundell's Tyrrell, they made contact at La Source and both continued, with Coulthard apologising for the incident after the race. Schumacher crossed the finish line first, with Hill 2nd and Häkkinen completing the podium. Verstappen, Coulthard and Blundell completed the top 6. That order changed, however, when Schumacher was disqualified after the race had finished. He had worn down the recently introduced wooden plank too far and gained an illegal aerodynamic advantage in the eyes of the stewards. His disqualification moved everyone up a position, so the final top 6 actually consisted of Hill, Häkkinen and Verstappen on the podium, then Coulthard, Blundell and Morbidelli's footwork completed the top 6. The two Ligiers of Panis and Bernard sandwiched the Minardis of Martini and Alboreto in positions 7 through 10, then Gunon's Simtek and Herbert's Lotus were 11th and 12th. Eddie Irvine was classified in 13th and last after his alternator failed on lap 40. Schumacher's lead in the driver's standings was now 21 points back to Hill, while Berger and Alesi maintained their 3rd and 4th positions. Hakkinen moved up to 5th ahead of Barrichello, with a Finn on 14 points. Benetton still led the Constructors' Championship, but Williams moved into 2nd ahead of Ferrari, with McLaren and Jordan still in 4th and 5th positions. Ahead of the Italian Grand Prix, several things happened that changed the course of the championship. The FIA upheld the initial 2-race ban given to Schumacher following his formation lap and black flag antics at the British Grand Prix, meaning he would miss the next races in Monza and Estoril. On the 7th of September, they also upheld his disqualification from the Belgian Grand Prix. Benetton had also been in trouble for the fuel filter fire at Hockenheim, but after investigation was carried out, it turned out the manufacturers of the fuel rigs had actually instructed many teams to remove the filter that had been attributed to cause the fire. Therefore, the team was not punished for this offence. Later would partner Verstappen, following the Michaels ban, and Zanardi was back in the Lotus after Adams' one-off appearance. Yannick Dalmas came back after several seasons out of F1 to partner Comas at Le Rousse. The last changes going into the weekend was a modification to the Lesmo 2 corner after there were calls to cut some trees down on the exit of the corner to create more runoff areas. Instead of increasing the runoff area, the track officials tightened the corner, thus making it slower and not need the extra space on the corner exit. The Tifosi went mad in qualifying as their cars locked out the front row with Alesi ahead of Berger. Hill was 3rd, then following Mugen Honda's upgrades brought to Monza, Johnny Herbert was a stunning 4th on the grid. The other Williams of Coulthard was 5th, then came Panis in 6th, Hakkinen in 7th, and De Cesaris in 8th. Irvine and Verstappen rounded out the top 10. At the race start, the Ferrari pair led Herbert, who had overtaken Hill on the run-up to the pair of chicanes at the start of the lap. However, behind them, a fast-starting Irvine locked up and hit Herbert, spinning him into the path of Coulthard. The track became blocked as the field tried to pick their way through the incident, and the red flag was brought out to restart the race. Herbert jumped in his spare car, which didn't have the upgraded engine package, and Coulthard jumped into the spare Williams chassis that was set up for Hill, while Irvine was demoted to the back of the grid for his involvement in the incident. The two Ferraris led the second restart away, then came Hill and Coulthard. Verstappen collided with Zanardi, collecting Morbidelli and taking all three out on the spot. After that early accident, it wasn't until lap 14 when more action came in the form of Herbert's alternator failing. Then when Alesi came in for his first stop a lap later, his gearbox failed as he exited his pit stop. Berger inherited his teammate's lead until lap 24 when Eric Comas held him up in the pits, allowing both Williams cars to pass the Ferrari. The race had a high attrition rate as only 10 cars finished, with the Saubers of Frentzen and De Cesaris retiring within 2 laps of each other and the Minardis of Alboreto and Martini also retiring in close proximity. Hill won the race to close the gap to Schumacher to 11 points, with Berger in second place. Hakkinen stood on the third step of the podium, then Barrichello was fourth. Brundle was fifth with Coulthard sixth. After running in second for most of the race, the Scot ran out of fuel coming out of Parabolica and couldn't make it to the finish line. The two Erics were 7th and 8th, with Bernard leading Comas, then came the only other finishers of Leto and Parnis. As previously mentioned, Schumacher's lead was cut down to 11 points in the driver's standings, with Berger and Alesi still in 3rd and 4th. Hakkinen was closing in, however, only 1 point behind Alesi. Williams closed the gap to 12 points in the Constructors' Championship, and Ferrari were 3rd in no man's land, while McLaren was starting to pull away from Jordan and consolidate their 4th place. Next up was Estoril. Just like Spa, Hockenheim and Catalunya, it had remodelled a fast bend, and it had completely butchered it, creating one of the singular worst so-called safety chicanes in racing history. It's not just slow and Mickey Mouse, it's like they purposely fucked with the elevation and camber to make it as unenjoyable as possible to drive. Schumacher was still banned, and later remained his deputy, and also at Lotus, Adams returned to help the cash-strapped team. Berger took his second pole position of the season, and the Ferrari's second pole position in 2 races, something not achieved since Nigel Mansell did so in 1990. Hill was second on the grid after an initial scare in Friday qualifying which saw him collide with Eddie Irvine and flip upside down, but he continued. Coulthard was 3rd, with Hakkinen 4th and Alesi 5th. Katayama was 6th, with Brundle, Barrichello, Frentzen and Verstappen rounding out the top 10. Berger led Coulthard and Hill until the Austrian's gearbox died on lap 8. Nothing much happened in the early stages until Katayama retired on lap 27 from inside the points. Then on lap 33, Coulthard had trouble lapping back markers which allowed Hill to sneak by. Then Alesi had even more trouble with lapped cars, as on lap 39 he retired after a crash with Brabham's Simtek. Hill won his 3rd race on the bounce, with Schumacher absent, and Coulthard was 2nd with Hakkinen 3rd. Barrichello was 4th, and Verstappen was 5th, picking up the crumbs for Benetton, while Brundle came home in 6th. Irvine was 7th, followed by the footworks of Fittipaldi and Morbidelli, then Bernard was 10th for Ligier. Herbert was 11th, followed by the Minardis of Martini and Alboreto, then Dalmas was 14th for Le Rousse. Gunon was 15th, and Adams took home the wooden spoon and last place of the finishers in 16th place. Parnis was initially classified in 9th, but was disqualified for illegal plank wear post-race. Heading into the last 3 races of the season, Schumacher led Hill by a mere 1 point. Berger was third, but Hakkinen had leapfrogged Alesi and was now fourth, ahead of the Frenchman. Williams usurped Benetton in the Constructors, where the Grove team on 89 points and Benetton on 87. Ferrari, McLaren and Jordan seemed pretty cemented in their 3rd, 4th and 5th places ahead of the next race in Jerez. The provisional 1994 calendar initially included the Argentine Grand Prix in Buenos Aires, but developments going on at the venue postponed its inclusion. Therefore, they held a replacement race at Jerez that was branded as a European Grand Prix. Schumacher was back from his 2-race ban, and Nigel Mansell was back at Williams as the kart season had now finished in the United States. More changes happened further down the grid as Herbert and Bernard at Lotus and Ligier switched places, then Hideki Noda replaced Dalmas at Larousse, and Domenico Sciattarella replaced Gounon at Simtek. Both Noda and Sciattarella were rookies. Schumacher took pole ahead of Hill and Mansell, then the surprise Sauber of Heinz-Harald Frentzen qualified 4th. Barrichello was 5th for Jordan, then Berger was 6th. Herbert was 7th on his Ligier debut, then Morbidelli, Hakkinen and Irvine completed the top 10. Hill overtook Schumacher at the start, while Mansell fell down to 6th. He repassed Berger and Barrichello within 6 laps, but the Jordan re-overtook him on lap 12. Debutant Noda retired early on with gearbox failure, but as he slowed, he was hit by Mansell, who needed a new nose cone and thus fell out of contention. Schumacher overtook Hill in the first round of pit stops, and Frentzen ran third until his one-stop strategy backfired and dropped into 7th later on in the race. Irvine overtook Hakkinen for third after Frentzen fell off, before being passed by the Finn in the second round of stops. Schumacher won with a 20-second gap back to Hill, with Hakkinen taking another podium in 3rd place. Irvine was 4th with Berger 5th, and Frentzen eventually finished 6th in the last points place. Katayama was 7th, then came Herbert and the French pair of Parnis and Alesi completing the top 10. 11th was Morbidelli, then it was Barrichello who suffered a puncture earlier on in 12th. Blundell was followed by Alboreto and Martinez Minardi's, while the 16th and 18th place Lotuses of Zanardi and Bernard sandwiched Fittipaldi in 17th. Sciattarella was 19th and last on his debut, 5 laps down. Schumacher led Hill by 5 points going into the final 2 rounds, and Berger was 3rd, still, with Hakkinen consolidating his 4th place driver standings position ahead of Alesi. Benetton retook the Constructors' Championship lead by 2 points over Williams, while Ferrari, McLaren and Jordan rounded out the top 5 in the same positions they had been for a while. The next race was the second to last round of the season in Suzuka. Benetton saw that rivals Williams had a very strong driver lineup heading into the final 2 races, and so Flavio Briatore prized Johnny Herbert from his Ligier deal so he could hopefully have a second car challenging for points. Frank Lagorce took his place at Ligier, while Mika Salo replaced Eric Bernard at Lotus, and Simtek hired Japanese pay driver Taki Inui to replace Sciattarella for his home race. JJ Leto replaced the recently retired Andre de Cesaris at Sauber. Schumacher was on pole yet again, with Hill in second, yet again. Frentzen put in another stunning display to qualify 3rd, ahead of the other Williams and Mansell in 4th. Herbert finally brought the second Benetton into contention by qualifying 5th, then came Irvine, Alesi, Hakkinen, Brundle and Barrichello completing the top 10. The race was held in torrential rain, causing several drivers to aquaplane. Noda spun off on the first lap, while Leto had an engine failure also on the first lap. The other 2 Japanese drivers, Katayama and Inui, lasted only until lap 3 before going off themselves, along with Johnny Herbert. Alboreto, Minardi and Lagorce went off on lap 10, then Berger's battery failed on lap 11. Morbidelli crashed at the S's on lap 13, then a lap later, Brundle spun off in the same place and hit a Marshall who was trying to recover the footwork that had been crashed the previous lap. The Marshall suffered a broken leg, and the race was red flagged. Where have we seen it before, where a car has gone off track at the same corner a lap after someone else? At Suzuka. It's almost as if Brundle said numerous times following this incident that the FIA should neutralise the race in areas where marshals and service vehicles are. Sounds familiar. When it got going again, Barrichello went out on lap 17 with transmission failure, then Blundell on lap 27 was out with engine issues. As the rain was starting to ease, the decision was taken by officials to run the race on aggregate. Since Schumacher had been leading by 6.8 seconds when the red flag was called for Brundle's crash, if Hill were to overtake him, he would need to pull out a gap of more than 6.8 seconds to win the race. You'd think that beating Schumacher by any margin in the wet would be impossible, but Hill drove like a man possessed in the last segment of the race. He later said that he felt an out-of-body experience similar to what Senna had talked about in the 1988 Monaco weekend, and he felt that he was driving like Senna would in those conditions. Hill pulled a gap of over 10 seconds in the last segment of the race, and therefore won on aggregate by 3.8 seconds to take the title down to the wire. Schumacher took second, over 50 seconds clear of 3rd place Alesi. 4th was Mansell, 5th was Irvine, and 6th was Frentzen. Hakkinen was 7th, just outside the points, then it was Fittipaldi, Comas, Salo, Panis, Brabham, and Zanardi who rounded out the 13 finishers. Going into the final race in Adelaide, Schumacher led Hill by 1 point, and it was a winner-takes-all situation. Williams also pulled back ahead of Benetton in the Constructors' Championship by 5 points heading into the final race, so both teams would be wanting both titles. The Larousse team was struggling for money again, so they replaced Comas with Swiss driver Jean-Denis Delatraz. Sciattarella was also back at Simtek after renewing his escapades in Suzuka. It was Mansell who took pole position for the final race of the year, with Schumacher alongside him on the front row. Hill was third and 6/10 off the front row pair, then fourth was Hakkinen. It was a Jordan 5-6 of Barrichello and Irvine, then Herbert was 7th for Benetton, followed by Alesi. Brundle and Frentzen rounded out the top 10. Schumacher and Hill assumed a 1-2 formation at the start, and they stayed there, albeit with fluctuating time gaps, until lap 36. Damon had been catching Michael until the German went off at East Terrace corner. Hill came round the corner just as Schumacher recovered, then seeing he was slow, Hill dove to the inside and Schumacher turned into him, sending the Benetton into the wall after iconically going at a 45-degree angle. Schumacher was out on the spot, but Hill limped back to the pit lane. He was hopeful his mechanics could assess the car and get him back out onto the track, but his suspension was terminally damaged, and so he retired from the race. With Schumacher and Hill out, a 40-year-old recently unretired Nigel Mansell won the race, with Berger close behind. Brundle was third for McLaren, then came Barrichello, Panis and Alesi completing the point scorers. The rest of the running order at the end of the race was Frentzen, Fittipaldi, Martini, Leto, Lagorce and Hakkinen, although Hakkinen had retired with brake issues on lap 76 of 81. The main talking point coming out of the final race was the controversial fashion in which the title was decided. BBC commentator Murray Walker expressed that Schumacher had not deliberately crashed into Hill, as some people said he did, whereas his commentary partner, Jonathan Palmer, said the crash was entirely Schumacher's fault. There's two sides to the coin, really. As much as you say Schumacher could have left Hill room, you could also say it was optimistic of Hill to dive up his inside, expecting Michael to be looking in his mirrors after having run off the track and safely returned to the racing line. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, really. I don't think it was premeditated, definitely not, and Schumacher's later so-called cheats can attest to that. Do I think he intentionally turned in knowing Hill was there? We'll never know for certain, but I think the split-second thoughts going through his head, and after having an off like that, it wouldn't have given him any time to think, to check every mirror and every blind spot and everything else before the next corner. I don't think it was Michael's fault, but that doesn't mean I necessarily think it was Damon's instead. He was, in my opinion, overly optimistic, or hopeful, but he had the right to go for that move. Thus, as an armchair expert, who wouldn't be born for another 10 years after this incident, I can say it was a racing incident in my opinion. 10 or 11 years ago, when I started watching F1, I think the general consensus was that Schumacher crashed intentionally, or maybe that's just a reflection of a mostly British, mostly biased media that I consumed back then, in the form of statistics books, F1 encyclopedias, and watching F1 classic races on Sky Sports for hours on end. I think general opinions have shifted, and people are more open to attributing it less harshly against Schumacher. Maybe it's because public opinion of him has gone up, or at least less people hate his guts now he can't defend himself. Maybe it's because Damon has become less likeable, as he's often labelled, quite fairly, as British biased in his modern-day punditry. I also think it doesn't help that F1 nerds like me, and many others, look at Damon's performances compared to his teammates throughout his career and realise he's not that special, and in my opinion, not entirely a championship-calibre driver. I'll spare him criticism for his first season in a top team against Prost, but in the first 3 races of '94, he wasn't even in the same postcode as Senna. Then when a rookie Coulthard came in, he was pretty much level with him in qualifying and could match him in the races. Then Mansell came out of semi-retirement at the end of his prime and built up to the point where he was 6/10 quicker than him in qualifying for Adelaide. 1995, Hill was too busy blowing up Schumacher every 5 seconds to make a run for the title. Then in '96, it was a good season for him, but he did only just beat a rookie Jacques Villeneuve, who in turn proved in his later career that it was a bit shit. Then in 1997 at Arrows, he did admittedly do well in Hungary and should have won, and beat Pedro Diniz, but I mean, it's Pedro Diniz, the most D-tier driver in F1 history. 1998 he was anonymous apart from Spa, where he won yet was 3 seconds a lap slower than teammate Ralf Schumacher, and although I'd do the exact same thing and ask the team to preserve the 1-2, I'm still going to criticise him for doing that. 1999, Frentzen was winning races while Hill was contemplating retirement, although I will give it to him that he was treated unfairly by Eddie Jordan, who made him stay past the British Grand Prix when he initially wanted to retire there. Damon is by no means a bad driver, but if you'd have put Senna or Mansell, or maybe even a 1995 version of David Coulthard in his position, I'm confident they'd have all won the title in his shoes. I think the fact that Hill was competitive from 1994 to '96 just proves how good those Williams cars were. Just look at him versus Villeneuve, for example. Villeneuve was a solid A-tier driver when he was at Williams in '96 and '97, and had flashes of brilliance just like Damon did, but as soon as he wasn't in the best car, he was dog shit. Hill is undoubtedly a good driver, and I can't imagine having that much pressure being the son of one of the best drivers in racing history, having to forge your own path and make your own waves following his untimely death. I'll never be able to comprehend his mental strength to get where he did, but compared to your Schumachers or your Sennas, he was nowhere near. I'll say he deserved his 96 title because of the storyline, and he did help that team stay competitive. And ironically, he also contributed to their downfall when his sacking after 1996 prompted Adrian Newey to leave Williams because he wanted Hill to stay, and Frank Williams and Patrick Head didn't listen to him. But none of that was Damon's fault. It's just a bit ironic he contributed to Williams' most successful era and contributed to its inevitable downfall. Anyways, I've just realised this entire section has dragged this video completely off topic, and I'm sorry, please forgive me. Schumacher won his first title, and Hill was bitter. It was a crazy season, with lots of crazy moments. 2 driver deaths, just like 1982, really put this season as one of the craziest in all time, and that's why this is one of the craziest seasons in F1 history. I think the season review was finished a long time ago, but I like to ramble on and rant, so that's what you've got for the past few minutes. I hope you all enjoyed my 500 subscriber special, and I hope I can continue providing great content for you all to enjoy in the future. Please like, comment and subscribe to the channel, follow my Instagram and subscribe to my Patreon. For now, I've been Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!